He wrote the words, sealed the letter, yet left it unsent. Welcome to Twilight Clue. I'm your host, Langford. I love hearing where you're tuning in from. Your voices make this journey richer. Let's begin. The quadrangle had a sound of its own that evening, though I doubt many would have noticed it. A faint echo of footsteps belonging to no one in particular, a rhythm stitched together by the rain that spattered against the flagstones and dripped along the worn stone ledges. It was not a night for conversation. The air had a damp, papery weight about it, the kind that makes you think of unopened books on high library shelves, of dust clinging stubbornly to the edges of vellum, of words written but never read. Oxford has its seasons, but it keeps its weather. Always a drizzle on the brink of meaning something. I had been walking not with purpose, but in that restless way that leads a man back to the places he has no reason to visit. A crossword clue had been teasing me all day. 5 letters, unsent truth. It sat at the corner of the page like a small rebuke, reminding me of what one doesn't say, what one cannot. I remember smiling without humor at my own inability to leave it alone. Words, after all, are a kind of tyranny. Once set down, they cannot be unsaid. Once withheld, they haunt the silence. The lamps along the cloister gave off their usual honeyed glow, not quite enough to dispel the shadows that moved between the arches. I passed a group of undergraduates emerging from the senior common room, their voices pitched in that blend of arrogance and uncertainty peculiar to youth. One of them remarked that Dr. Morland would not be in tonight, though his absence was spoken of lightly, with the indifference of those who assume tomorrow will arrive just as today did. I did not then know what his absence would come to mean, though something in the tone snagged against me, like a nail hidden in the wood. I stood for a while by the iron gate that separates the quadrangle from the street beyond. The sound of the traffic was muffled, as if the college walls had learned to keep the world at bay. It is one of Oxford's gifts, that illusion of seclusion, the sense that here time has its own stubborn pace. Bells marked the half-hour, not impatiently, but as though gently reminding us that life was still proceeding even if unnoticed. Later, I found myself in the library. It was near closing, and the long tables were deserted save for a solitary reader in the corner, head bent over a sheaf of notes, a small lamp illuminating the page. The smell there was always the same, paper fibers and leather bindings, mingled with a faint trace of polish that never quite masked the mildew creeping into the floorboards. I remember running my hand along a spine embossed with Latin I half recognized, feeling the cold press of gilt letters under my fingers. I thought again of that clue, unsent truth, and considered the many books that had been written but never opened, messages sealed and lost to the silence of centuries. It was strange who interrupted the mood, though not in person. A telephone call had found me earlier that day, asking me to keep an eye on a small matter at St. Anselm's. A fellow failing to appear for an appointment, nothing more. Routine, perhaps even trivial, but there are no trivialities in Oxford. Every absence contains within it the possibility of permanence. The corridors creaked as I left, a long groan like an old man shifting in his chair. I pulled the door shut softly, though there was no one to hear. Crossing the quadrangle again, I noticed a letter lying in the damp near the chapel steps, its envelope sodden, the ink blurred into a blue-grey smear. I stooped to pick it up, but the words had already dissolved. Nothing remained but the impression of handwriting that once had meaning. It struck me as oddly appropriate, a letter meant for no one, addressed to nothing, a ghost of a message. I slipped it into my pocket, not knowing why. Perhaps because unsent truths have a way of returning, whether we wish them to or not. When I finally left the college, the rain had thinned to a mist that clung to the lamplight. I felt the tug of melancholy that often comes at such times, when the world is half blurred and half too clear. Behind me, the quadrangle settled once more into its private silence, a silence broken only by the drip of rain into the stone basin of the fountain. And I thought then, though I could not have explained it, that something had already begun. Not an event, not a crime in the ordinary sense, but a disturbance of balance. A note struck slightly sharp in a melody that had until then played smoothly enough. It would be some time before I understood the meaning of the letter that was never posted, or of the man who signed it. But the quadrangle knew, I think. The stones remember what the living forget. It was Lewis who brought me the news, though his voice carried none of the weight of tragedy. To him it was an administrative irregularity, the sort of matter that might as easily have belonged to the bursar's ledger as to the coroner's book. Dr. Philip Morland, Fellow of St. Anselm's, had been discovered in his rooms that morning. The porter had forced the door when repeated knockings went unanswered. The man was seated at his desk, head tilted slightly to one side as though dozing in contemplation of the fire. But the fire had long since guttered out. His face was calm, a little pale, and the doctor's certificate would soon declare the matter natural causes. Yet there was the letter. It lay on the desk before him, weighted by the brass inkstand. A single sheet of paper folded neatly once, signed with his unmistakable hand but never addressed. No envelope, no recipient, only words that seemed at once hesitant and final. I read them later in the lodge office, the rain dripping from my coat as I leaned against the small desk, while Lewis fidgeted at my side. The letter began without salutation, a curious omission for a man of Morland's pedantic temperament. Its sentences were short, urgent, not unlike the clipped cadences of a confession. An old debt, it said, must at last be acknowledged. What must be confessed before it is too late? There was mention of betrayal, though the nature of it remained veiled. Then the abrupt conclusion, the ink darker where the pen had lingered over his name. He had signed it. He had not posted it. Lewis remarked that perhaps he had forgotten to buy a stamp. He smiled a little uneasily. But I knew at once that men like Morland did not forget such things. Parents carry their envelopes in neat piles, their postage prepaid in rolls. The absence of an address was not forgetfulness. It was design. The unsent truth once more, the clue that had troubled me the previous day. I asked to see the desk itself. The room smelled of extinguished fire, of damp ash and old paper. The books were aligned too carefully, as though placed for display rather than for use. On the mantelpiece stood a small photograph of a younger Morland in cap and gown, beside two other figures I did not yet recognize. The chair still bore the imprint of his weight. I ran my hand across the leather desktop, noting the faint impression left by the letter where it had lain. Lewis busied himself with the obvious, asking the porter about comings and goings, the timing of meals, the locking of gates. The porter told him that Dr. Morland had been in poor health, a touch of angina perhaps not unexpected. The chaplain had called on him 2 nights before, though nothing unusual was observed. A quiet man, mostly alone, often late in the library. All this sounded ordinary enough. But ordinariness is the veil most often drawn across mischief. I remember standing by the window that overlooked the quadrangle, the drizzle still falling, the stone shining like oiled metal. My reflection wavered in the glass, pale and uncertain. I thought of the line he had written, "Before it is too late." Yet too late for what? To redeem himself? To implicate another? To unburden the heart of its secrets? Men write letters not for themselves, but for their imagined readers. Whoever that reader was, they were absent here. And absence is a louder voice than presence. I sat in his chair for a moment, the view of the quadrangle stretching into shadow. I thought of another absence, the missing envelope, the missing address. A deliberate withholding. Perhaps I considered he had not intended the letter to reach anyone at all. Perhaps its purpose lay only in being written, the ink itself the act of confession. But then why sign it? Why commit his name, the most unambiguous mark of all? Lewis interrupted my reverie, placing a small tin on the desk. "Found it in his drawer, sir. Ordinary enough, cough sweets, spectacles, bank statements. But the statements revealed a curious withdrawal, a large sum only days before his death. Cash, not accounted for in the room." Lewis raised an eyebrow in his usual way, the question hovering between us. I told him to leave it, for now. As we left the room, I glanced back once more at the desk, the letter still beneath the brass stand. Words without destination, words heavy with silence. And I thought again of the crossword clue, unsent truth. Ghost. The answer had come to me belatedly, and with it a chill, for words unsent do not vanish. They linger, they haunt. That night over whiskey I read the letter again, this time aloud in the privacy of my rooms. The rain pressed against the window, the glass vibrating faintly with each gust of wind. The words seemed to alter in the lamplight, as though meaning shifted with each reading. An old debt, betrayal, confession, too late. The letter had not been posted, but its silence demanded an answer. I have often thought that cloisters hold their own peculiar acoustics. Words spoken there never quite escape, but settle into the stone like chalk rubbed into a blackboard. It was beneath those arches, the rain whispering on the slate roofs above, that I began the slow procession through the lives of those who had known Philip Morland, or perhaps not known at all, for knowledge is rarely what it pretends to be. The first was Dr. Emily Hale, who greeted me with a faint smile that seemed rehearsed in front of a mirror. She had the angular elegance of a woman who had once been admired, and still carried the residue of it like perfume that lingers after the wearer has left the room. She spoke of Morland with a composure too measured, the words precise yet drained of warmth. He was a colleague, she said, respected for his scholarship. But there was something in the way she folded her hands, the faint whiteness of the knuckles, that hinted at quarrels not confined to the classroom. When I mentioned the letter, her eyes flickered to the side before settling once more into studied calm. I made a note of the flicker, though only in the privacy of my mind. Professor Anthony Venn was next. He had the briskness of a man who mistrusts silence, filling it with talk of finance, modernization, the urgent need to bring the college into the 20th century, as though centuries were trains one might catch by running hard enough. He spoke of Morland's conservatism as an obstacle, a hindrance to progress. I watched him polish his spectacles with unnecessary vigor while he explained that academic institutions must adapt or perish. His tone was not one of grief, and when he misquoted Tennyson, offering a fragment too clumsy for a classicist, I noticed the lapse with that sharp satisfaction one feels when a crossword answer presents itself unbidden. A small detail, but all misquotations carry the smell of carelessness or concealment. The Reverend Charles Keating presented himself in the chapel vestry, the candles burning low despite the daylight. His voice was gentle, his manner deferential. He spoke of Morland as a soul in need of grace, and there was the faintest tremor when I asked if they had spoken recently. 2 nights ago, he said, but nothing of consequence was discussed. Yet I detected in his phrasing a careful choice of words, as if he had rehearsed them in solitude. The chaplain's Bible lay open on the desk, its margins annotated in Morland's handwriting, though Keating claimed never to have seen it before. I touched the ink with my finger and found it fresh enough to smear. He saw me notice and turned the page too quickly, and then there was Clara Morland. The widow received me in her drawing-room, where the curtains were half drawn against the wet afternoon. She was handsome still, in a way that carried dignity more than beauty, though her eyes seemed reluctant to meet mine. She spoke of her late husband as though describing a relative long estranged, polite but distant. Their marriage, she admitted, had withered years before, held together only by the threads of habit and college expectation. She had remained, she said, for the sake of appearances. When I asked if she knew of the letter, her lips parted as though to reply, but then closed again with the quiet finality of a door shutting on a dark corridor. Lewis, dutiful as ever, took notes while I lingered on impressions. Each voice carried not merely words but pauses, and it was in the pauses that meaning leaked through. Hale's flicker of the eyes, Venn's misquotation, Keating's rehearsed phrases, Clara's silence. None of it amounted to accusation, yet all of it felt like smoke rising from unseen fire. That evening I walked once more through the cloisters alone. The rain had ceased, leaving the stones slick and gleaming, the arches echoing faintly with my own footsteps. I thought again of the letter. An old debt, it had said, betrayal, confession. The words might belong to any of them, for each had debts of one kind or another, each betrayed something, love, duty, faith, or truth. And perhaps in their own way, each longed for confession, though never allowed. I paused beneath the lantern's dim glow and recalled a crossword clue I had once solved. Debt unpaid, 3 letters. The answer had been sin. I wondered as I lit my pipe and tasted the bitterness of the tobacco, whether Morland's letter had been less about finance than about the ledger no man escapes. The kind written not in ink but in silence. I have always mistrusted certainty. Whenever a man or woman speaks with too much conviction, I find myself listening not to the words, but to the small betrayals hidden in the pauses. It was with that in mind that I turned once more to Professor Anthony Venn, whose appetite for modernization at St. Anselm's seemed to me too loudly proclaimed, too rehearsed. He filled silences with words as one might fill a void with plaster. quickly, impatiently, without regard for the cracks beneath. We sat together in his oak-panelled office, the windows misted with rain. He spoke again of finances, of the college's desperate need for new accommodation blocks, for lecture halls equipped with modern wiring. Morland, he insisted, had been obstinate, unyielding, a stumbling block to progress. While he spoke, I found myself studying the shelves behind him. Their rows of leather-bound classics were immaculate, spines uncreased, as though chosen for display rather than companionship. It struck me that here was a man who preferred the facade of scholarship to its quiet burden. He reached for a quotation to illustrate his point, speaking of knowledge old and knowledge new, and attributed it, with a certain flourish, to Tennyson. Yet the line was not Tennyson's but Wordsworth's, lifted from a sonnet I had once puzzled over in my undergraduate days. The misattribution struck me immediately, sharp as a pinprick, for Venn was no careless undergraduate. He was a man whose reputation depended upon the correctness of detail, a man who did not err in such matters, unless of course he wished to. Lewis Oblivious scribbled in his notebook. So I let the misquotation hang in the air like a sour note in an otherwise polished performance. I said nothing, not then, but in my mind the misdirected phrase lingered, troubling the waters of his narrative. I had learned long ago that truth rarely arrives in declarations. It slips instead through the cracks of error. Afterwards, Lewis and I walked through the cloisters once more, our footsteps echoing against the dripping stone. He asked if I believed Venn. I told him belief was a dangerous word. Faith belonged in chapels. Investigations demanded doubt. Lewis frowned, unused to riddles. Yet I could not give him more, for the matter was not ready to be spoken. The rain had eased, leaving a fine mist that clung to the arches. We paused near the porter's lodge, where a notice board displayed the weekly rota of lectures and tutorials. My eyes fell upon Morland's name, printed neatly beside a cancelled class. The handwriting that scrawled across it, cancelled health, was not Morland's. It was Hale's, delicate, unmistakable. A small thing, but I wondered why she had taken the liberty to announce his frailty to the students. Acts of kindness and acts of possession are easily confused. Later that evening, back in my rooms, I poured a measure of whiskey and unfolded the letter once more. Its phrases, clipped and urgent, began to merge with Venn's misquotation in my mind, as though words shuffled themselves when left too long in silence. Betrayal, debt, confession, all words that spoke of the past rather than the future. Men rarely confess to what they intend to do. They confess to what has already stained them. The crossword in the Times that day offered a clue which amused me. 4 letters to misquote unintentionally or not. The answer, slip, seemed almost too neat. I wrote it in, then stared at the word until the lines blurred. A slip can be careless or it can be deliberate. It is the task of the detective to know the difference, though the difference is often invisible. Lewis telephoned to report that Morland had withdrawn a substantial sum from his account days before his death. The money, he said, was missing still. I asked him to repeat the figure, though I had heard it well enough the first time. Numbers, when repeated, do not change, but the voice that repeats them sometimes does. Lewis's unease was clear. He believed, with a policeman's instinct, that the missing money pointed to motive. But instinct, I reminded him silently, is not always the twin of truth. I ended the call and sat in the dim light, the rain pressing faintly at the window. Somewhere in the silence between Venn's slip and Morland's missing money lay a connection not yet visible. I felt it as one feels the faint outline of a word emerging in an unfinished crossword. Letters not yet filled, but the shape undeniable. And yet I was not comforted. The human heart, I reflected, is the most misdirected phrase of all. It speaks truths it does not mean, and conceals truths it cannot bear. Morland had signed his name to a letter without destination. Venn had borrowed words from a poet not his own. Both in their way had spoken falsely. The question remained, to what end? It was Clara Morland who placed the diary into my hands, though she did so with a reluctance that felt heavier than the object itself. We sat in her drawing room, the curtains pulled half across the windows, filtering the late afternoon light into a colourless haze. The fire had long gone cold, leaving only the faintest trace of smoke clinging to the stone hearth. She said she had found the book among her husband's papers, tucked into a drawer he rarely used. Her voice was steady enough, but I noticed the way she did not meet my eyes when she spoke. The diary was slim, bound in black leather now fraying at the edges. Several pages had been torn clean away. Others were discolored, their margins browned and brittle, as though they had been exposed to flame. I turned a singed corner between my fingers, smelling faint ash. It was not the neat destruction of someone wishing to obliterate evidence, but the hurried act of one who feared discovery and had no time to finish the work. Lewis leaned over my shoulder as I studied the surviving entries. The handwriting was small, precise, unhurried. There were notes of lectures, references to the Bodleian, stray quotations from the poets he so often taught. But threaded among them were more personal observations, meetings unnamed, allusions to a secret burden. One line in particular caught my attention. Tuesday Bodleian, 10 o'clock. Truth cannot be postponed. I read it twice, hearing in its clipped rhythm an echo of the unfinished letter. Clara excused herself briefly, leaving us in the stillness of the room. Lewis remarked that the entries proved nothing, that many scholars kept records of their appointments. He was right, of course. But it was the tone that unsettled me. Scholars record, yes, but they do not normally confess. When Clara returned, she asked whether the diary would be required. Her voice trembled on the word required, as though it implied an intrusion more intimate than she could bear. I told her gently that I would keep it for the present. She nodded, folding her hands tightly in her lap, and did not ask again. Later, in my own rooms, I spread the diary across the desk and read the entries aloud under the lamp's glow. My voice sounded foreign to me, the words acquiring a weight they had not possessed in silence. Several passages bore marks where the pen had pressed too hard, the ink darker, the paper indented as if the writer had wrestled with each word. One half-burned page contained a fragment that seemed to whisper of more than scholarly concern. It spoke of a debt unpaid, a reckoning that could not be deferred. The sentence broke off where the edge of the page blackened into nothing. That night the crossword offered me an irony too pointed to ignore. Burnt remains 5 letters. The answer was ember. I wrote it down absently, yet the word clung to me. For an ember is not dead fire. It is fire that waits, diminished but alive, capable of reigniting when stirred. The diary, I felt, was such an ember. The next morning I took myself to the Bodleian, compelled by the entry that had marked Tuesday, 10 o'clock. The great library had its usual perfume of paper and polish, its silence punctuated only by the creak of floorboards and the shuffling of students who seemed both reverent and weary. I stood among the long rows of books, imagining Morland seated at one of the desks, his pen poised over the diary, the weight of some truth pressing on him. As I traced the aisles, I found myself pausing at an inscription inside a volume of Don's sermons. Written in a hand not unlike Morland's, though more fluid, were the words, "All confession is but a flame seeking air." I stared at it longer than I should have, knowing that the inscription was likely decades old, irrelevant, a mere coincidence. And yet I could not shake the sensation that Morland's ghost had passed through here, leaving only ash and echoes. When I left the Bodleian, the bells were tolling noon. The quadrangles outside glistened from a recent shower, and students hurried across the wet stones, their gowns billowing like shadows. I walked slowly, the diary pressed beneath my arm, its pages whispering as though they carried secrets too fragile for air. I thought of Morland's letter, unsigned in its intent though signed with his name, and of these burnt pages, half silent, half still alive. "Truth cannot be postponed," he had written, but truth, I knew, is most often postponed indefinitely. And sometimes it is burned, not into absence, but into permanence. The bursar's rooms were always too warm. Venn kept a small fire burning even in spring, and the heavy curtains sealed the air as though he feared the intrusion of draughts or truths. He offered me a chair and began again his litany about Morland's obstructionism, his refusal to approve the college's plans, his ancient loyalties to a vision of Oxford already obsolete. He spoke quickly, his hands in motion, and I could almost hear the rehearsed rhythm of an argument he had delivered many times before. Lewis, seated dutifully by the window, asked about access to funds. Venn admitted he had managed certain accounts, but denied ever interfering with Morland's. The denial was too prompt, too polished. His spectacles caught the firelight as he leaned forward, explaining how vital it was that men of Morland's ilk should not be allowed to hold back progress. It was then I noticed his thumb rubbing at the bridge of his glasses, an absent gesture, almost compulsive. Not nervousness, perhaps, but something near to it. The missing money loomed large in our minds. Her withdrawal days before Morland's death, cash that could not be traced. Venn denied any knowledge, of course. Yet when I mentioned the precise sum, his eyes flickered with the faintest recognition before his expression resumed its confident neutrality. It might have been nothing. It might have been everything. We walked together after the interview, Lewis and I, across the rain-drenched quadrangle. He was certain we had our man, the financial motive, the quarrels, the access. He ticked the points off on his fingers like a schoolboy reciting facts for an exam. And I almost envied him the clarity, the comfort of believing that human affairs can be arranged into lists. But clarity is the enemy of truth. The moment the pieces fit too snugly, I begin to distrust the puzzle. That night back in my flat, I considered the bursar's words again. His misquotation of Tennyson still pricked at me. Why would a man so concerned with appearances allow himself such an error? Unless, of course, he was performing, scattering crumbs in the wrong direction, drawing attention where none belonged. A red herring, to use the crude parlance. I poured another whiskey and felt the familiar weight of futility pressing at my shoulders. Men lie most convincingly when they lie for reasons we cannot yet see. The crossword yielded its own small irony. Motive falsely assumed, 6 letters. The answer was decoy. I filled it in, then closed the paper sharply, as though silencing a voice I did not wish to hear. The following morning, I retraced my steps to Morland's rooms, hoping the stillness of the place might yield more than words had done. The book smelled faintly of mildew. The curtains hung limp with damp. On the mantelpiece, the photograph of the 3 figures still stared mutely into the past. I stared back, willing them to speak. There was something odd about the way Morland's hand rested on the shoulder of the man beside him. Not affectionate, not possessive, but almost protective. I could not yet place it. Lewis joined me there, convinced that Venn had manipulated funds and silenced Morland to prevent exposure. His certainty grew with every phrase. I let him speak. It is useful sometimes to hear the voice of conviction, if only to measure one's own doubt against it. Before leaving, I examined once more the diary we had taken. A page half-burned, its words only partially legible, mentioned an appointment with A.V. I assumed the initials stood for Anthony Venn. It seemed conclusive enough, yet I have learned to distrust the obvious. The diary bore signs of tempering. Pages removed, fragments destroyed. Who was to say the initials had not been written to lead us astray? As I walked out through the college gates, the air damp with the smell of rain on stone, I felt the bursar's shadow following me. And yet it was not his shadow that troubled me most. It was the sense that Morland himself had orchestrated a final performance, tearing, burning, withholding, so that we, the audience left behind, might follow the wrong tune. Red herrings have a way of stinking too soon. The trick is to smell them before the rest of the fish has rotted. The chapel smelled of candle wax and damp hymnals. It was a late afternoon when I found the Reverend Keating, seated in his vestry, the light slanting weakly through stained glass that had long since lost its brightness. He rose when I entered, though the movement seemed reluctant, as if he would rather remain hidden in his chair with the silence wrapped around him like a robe. His eyes, mild to the point of evasiveness, did not meet mine until courtesy demanded it. We exchanged the preliminaries, the weather, the college term, the sudden sadness of Morland's passing. His voice was a whisper in that dim chamber, and I found myself leaning forward to hear. He claimed that he and Morland had spoken 2 nights before, though he insisted that nothing of consequence had been said. The phrasing struck me at once. Nothing of consequence. People rarely qualify absence, unless something of consequence has in fact taken place. On the vestry desk lay an open Bible. I recognized the marginalia immediately. Morland's tight, deliberate script. Yet Keating told me he had never seen those notes before. The ink was too fresh, the impressions still slightly raised. He turned the page quickly when he saw my finger brush against the smear. It was a small thing, but silence often begins with such small evasions. Lewis asked him gently about Morland's health, his spirits, whether he had seemed disturbed. Keating's hands twisted together, his fingers knotting in clerical black. He said Morland had carried his burdens alone, that some men do not confide even when they ought. His words trembled at the edges, and I could not tell whether the tremor came from grief or fear. Grief or fear. I pressed a little harder, asking if Morland had ever spoken of debts, of confession, of betrayal. The Reverend paused, and I thought he would deny it outright. Instead, he looked down at his hands and admitted, barely above a whisper, that Morland had known something from the past, something that could not be allowed to surface. His voice caught on the word surface, as though it were a stone lodged in the throat. When I asked what that secret was, he shook his head. He swore he could not tell me. His refusal was cloaked in the language of pastoral duty, but I suspected it was self-preservation, dressed as piety. The bells tolled outside, soft but insistent, and for a moment we both fell silent. I looked around the vestry, the worn cassocks hanging like shadows, the faint smell of incense long faded into the wood. There was a sense of secrecy clinging to the place, as though the walls had listened too often to words spoken in confidence. That evening I thought again of the Reverend's choice of phrase. Nothing of consequence. Words that deny while confirming. I remembered, too, the hurried way he turned the Bible's page, the faint smear of ink that betrayed its freshness. Someone had been altering the evidence of Morland's mind, reshaping his voice in those margins. Whether it was Keating or another, I could not yet say. The crossword that night offered me an accidental comfort. Hidden truth, 7 letters. The answer was silence. I filled it in without hesitation and sat back with my glass of whiskey, listening to the rain strike faintly against the window. Silence is never empty. It hums with the words unsaid, the deeds half buried. Keating's silence was not the peace of faith. It was the silence of fear. Lewis, ever the practical man, argued that the chaplain had motive enough. A man of God blackmailed, his past threatened by revelation. But I was not ready to draw the line so quickly. Fear is motive for silence, not always for murder. And besides, Morland's death still bore the pallor of nature, though nature is not exempt from human interference. As I extinguished the lamp that night, I thought again of Keating's whispered admission. Something from the past. The phrase lingered in my mind as I drifted into uneasy sleep. For it is always the past that shapes the present, always the old sins that rise beneath the stones we tread each day, and in that silence I heard the faintest echo, Morland's voice unfinished, confessing to a truth that would not stay buried. The archive room was not a place frequented by many. A faint chill lingered there, as though even the warmth of the day hesitated to enter. Dust motes drifted in narrow beams of light from high windows, and the smell was unmistakable. The patient scent of paper too long untouched, mingled with polish gone dull from years of disuse. It was Lewis who had found the photograph, tucked in a folder of old college memorabilia, and he carried it as if it might crumble in his hands. We spread it out on the desk, the sepia tones blurring slightly with age. It was a formal college portrait, scholars in their gowns, their faces solemn in that curiously self-conscious way that comes from staring too long at a camera lens. My eyes settled almost immediately on Morland, his expression serious, his posture erect. Beside him stood Emily Hale, younger, her beauty not yet diminished by the sharpness time lends to features. But it was the third figure who drew my attention, their woman, a little apart from the others, her face lit with a candor unusual in such stiff photographs. Her name, handwritten on the back, was Margaret Bell Lewis, reading aloud, explained she had once been a librarian here, leaving under circumstances not fully documented. A scandal, whispered perhaps, but never recorded officially. The college had a talent for erasure when it wished. I stared at her face, luminous still in the faded print, and thought of the letter Morland had left unfinished. Its urgency, its tone of confession. Was she the recipient he could no longer reach? A message signed but never posted, intended for a woman long vanished. The archive creaked as I walked its narrow aisles, the wood protesting each step. I found myself imagining Morland returning here in secret, standing where I now stood, looking again at her image. The loneliness of men who live too long with their regrets is a loneliness I know well. Perhaps he had meant the letter for her, though she had been gone these 30 years. The dead are often our most faithful correspondents. Emily Hale's face beside his in the photograph told its own story. There was an intimacy in the tilt of her shoulder toward him, a closeness more eloquent than words. Yet Margaret Bell's presence altered the balance. as though the three of them were bound by a triangle of history whose sides had never quite resolved. I remembered Emily's slight flicker of the eyes when I mentioned the letter, and I wondered if what she feared was not exposure of her own affairs with Morland, but of her friendship with Margaret. Lewis asked if I believed the photograph proved anything. Proof is a clumsy word. Photographs do not prove. They suggest. They whisper of connections, of proximities, of hands almost touching. They leave the rest for imagination to embroider. Later, in the quiet of my rooms, I poured a whiskey and studied the photograph once more under lamplight. The faces looked back at me, unspeaking yet eloquent. I traced Morland's eyes with my finger, then hers. What had been between them? A love unfulfilled? A secret too dangerous for the times? Perhaps nothing but admiration. The ambiguity, like the half-burnt pages of the diary, was the very point. The crossword that evening mocked me with its neatness. Absent friend, 8 letters. The answer was ghostly. I wrote it down with a heaviness I could not shake. Margaret Bell was absent, yes, but her absence had the weight of presence, the density of silence that changes everything around it. I returned to the archive the next morning, compelled by something I could not name. As I opened the folder again, I noticed a faint impression on the paper, where another sheet had once lain atop the photograph. A ghost outline of handwriting, blurred and reversed. Someone had pressed pen to paper here, perhaps long ago, perhaps more recently. The marks were illegible, but the fact of them was enough. Margaret Bell's name had not been forgotten. It had been written, erased, and written again. When I stepped out into the quadrangle, the rain had begun once more, steady and relentless. Students hurried by, their gowns darkened with damp. I stood alone beneath the dripping stone, the photograph in my coat pocket, feeling the peculiar melancholy of lives half-lived, half-erased. The dead, I reflected, are rarely silent. They speak through photographs, through diaries, through letters never posted. Margaret Bell had been gone for decades, yet she lingered more vividly than the living. And Morland, in the final days of his life, had written to her as though she still waited in some library corner, ready to read his words. It was then I knew that the past was not merely backdrop to this case. It was the case. There are moments when a case seems to resist you, like a lock into which no key will quite fit. You rattle it, coax it, curse it, and still the mechanism refuses to turn. Then, almost always when you have stopped expecting it, a small shift occurs. A clue, trivial in itself, clicks into place, and the whole structure begins to tremble with possibility. For me, it was a crossword that did it. That evening I had taken myself to the pub, not for company but for solitude disguised as custom. The regulars knew better than to disturb me. I sat by the window with my pint, the crossword folded neatly beside the glass. Rain traced diagonal lines across the pane, distorting the blurred glow of passing headlights. I filled in words half-heartedly, distracted by the muddle of Morland's life, his unsigned letter, the burnt diary, the photograph of Margaret Bell smiling faintly through 30 years of dust. The clue was short. To send without posting 5 letters. I frowned at it, sipped my beer, tried half a dozen possibilities. Then the answer slid into place with cruel simplicity. Ghost. I wrote it in, the pen pressing harder than I intended. And as the ink bled slightly into the cheap newsprint, I felt something else bleed through my mind. Ghost. An unsent truth. A letter signed but never posted, because its intended reader was no longer alive. I left the paper on the table and stared at the rain-smeared street beyond the glass. If Morland had written to Margaret Bell, he had known she could never read it. The act of writing was its own confession. The unsent letter was not a plea for reconciliation, but a monument to memory. Yet someone else had feared it. Someone had interfered with the diary, with the pages half-burnt. Silence preserved is often more dangerous than truth revealed. Lewis joined me briefly, reluctant as always to intrude. He spoke of fresh bank records, of times and withdrawals, of numbers that might prove Ven's guilt. He was eager for conclusions. I listened, nodding when politeness required, but my mind was elsewhere. Numbers are tidy things. People are not. When he left, I was almost relieved by the return of solitude. Back in my rooms, I spread the photograph on the desk again, placing the diary beside it and the letter beneath the brass lamp. 3 artifacts of a man's unraveled conscience. Margaret's face smiled faintly from the photograph, the edges frayed, her name scrawled in fading ink. The diary whispered of meetings, of truth not postponed. The letter insisted on betrayal, on confession too late. Ghost, the crossword had said. It was too neat, and yet sometimes neatness is truth. Sometimes neatness is truth. I poured whiskey and listened to the faint patter of rain against the sill. My reflection in the window looked older than I felt, though perhaps not by much. I thought of Morland seated in his room, pen in hand, signing a letter meant for a dead woman. What fear had driven someone else to burn his diary? Whose name, half hidden in those pages, had carried weight enough to survive 30 years of silence? At some point in the small hours, I returned to the crossword. A second clue had caught my eye. Concealed by time, 9 letters. The answer, forgotten, emerged with a kind of inevitability. But things forgotten are not always gone. They resurface like Margaret Bell's smile, like the smear of fresh ink in Keating's Bible, like the slip of Wordsworth mistaken for Tennyson. Small cracks in carefully tended facades. I thought then of Emily Hale, her careful composure, her hands clenched too tightly in her lap. I thought of Venn, rubbing the bridge of his glasses as he filled the air with talk of progress. I thought of Keating, whispering nothing of consequence while turning a page too quickly. And through them all I thought of Morland, who had chosen not to post the truth but to sign it anyway. The room grew colder as the night wore on. I poured another measure, leaned back in my chair and stared at the crossword again. Ghost. Forgotten. Words inked on a flimsy page, but heavy enough to alter the course of lives. I felt the first tremor of certainty then, though I knew better than to name it aloud. Certainty is a fragile thing, easily broken by morning light. Still, as I closed my eyes, I thought of Morland's pen pressing into the paper, the ink darkening on his name. He had written for the dead, and yet it was the living who trembled. The college hall had that particular smell of polish and damp wood that never quite leaves it, no matter how many coats of varnish are applied. Long tables stretched into the gloom, and portraits of forgotten men stared down from the walls, as if to remind us that all things pass into silence eventually. It was here, beneath their solemn gaze, that I gathered them, Hale, Venn, Keating, and the widow, to lay out what little could be said with certainty. I spoke slowly, not because I enjoyed the weight of their attention, but because truth, when it arrives, ought never to be hurried. Morland, I told them, had died of natural causes. His heart had ceased its patient labor, and there had been no violence. Yet his death had stirred up the past like silt in a river, clouding everything around it. The letter unsigned in its destination, the diary half burnt, the photograph of Margaret Bell. Each was not evidence of crime, but of concealment. Van shifted in his chair, polishing his spectacles with that compulsive thumb of his, as though clarity of glass could excuse the fog of words. Hale sat very straight, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles whitened. The Reverend looked down at the table, lips moving silently, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in fear. Clara Morland gazed at me with the resignation of one who has endured too many revelations already. I laid the letter on the table. Its words were brief, almost brusque, but unmistakable. An old debt, betrayal, confession, and yet it had never been posted, for its recipient was beyond reach. Margaret Bell, gone these 30 years, still lingered between them like smoke. Morland had written for the dead. But the living had feared what the dead might reveal. Hale's composure cracked first. She admitted that she had found the letter among Morland's papers, that she had feared its implications. Margaret had been her friend, she whispered, her voice so low I had to lean forward to catch it. More than a friend, perhaps, a bond formed in the shadows of a time that did not forgive such bonds. She had feared that Morland, in his final days, would expose what had long been buried, and so she had torn pages from the diary, burned what she could not face. She had not killed him. She had silenced him after death. Keating raised his head then, his eyes wet, and spoke of his own guilt, an indiscretion from years past that Morland had known. Yet his words sounded less like confession than deflection, as if to bury Hale's truth beneath his own. Venn said nothing, only rubbed at the bridge of his spectacles again, as though polishing away a stain only he could see. Clara closed her eyes. I told them that no prosecution would follow. Morland's death was his own, his heart failing of its natural course. What remained was the aftermath, the shredded diary, the unsent letter, the silence too long maintained. The law could not summon Margaret Bell from her grave, nor could it measure the weight of lives bent by secrecy. When they left, one by one, their footsteps echoing across the hall, I remained behind. The portraits stared down, unmoved, as though nothing new had been spoken beneath them. I gathered the letter and slipped it back into my pocket. Kerr signed confession without an audience, a truth left deliberately unposted. Later, alone with my whiskey, I filled in the day's crossword. The clue read, "To remain unsent, 6 letters." I wrote linger, and I thought of Morland, of Margaret, of Emily's trembling voice. Some truths linger, whether or not we wish them to. Some letters remain forever sealed, their contents already known to the silence that surrounds us. Outside, rain traced lines down the window. The bells tolled somewhere beyond the mist, their sound low and steady, marking time not for the living but for the ghosts who wait beside us. And I wondered, not for the first time, whether confession is ever meant to be heard, or whether it is simply the act of writing that matters. The pen pressed to paper, the ink darkening, the name signed at the bottom. Morland had signed the letter. But he had never posted it, and perhaps that in the end was all he intended.